So hello and welcome to another episode of TopTenz. I'm your interim host, Karl Smallwood. That's Karl with a K, followed by Smallwood, spelled exactly the way that it sounds. And today we're talking about 10 insane storms from throughout history. And normally at this point in the video is when I would mention that the video you're about to watch is based on a script submitted to us by a member of our writing team. But I can't say that today because it turns out the video you're about to watch was written by me. Every time a storm of significant size strikes an area of the globe, the news will clamber to find statistics that paint the storm in, shall we say, a record-breaking light, because it's bloody windy outside isn't going to get any eyeballs on the screen, is it? Which is odd when you consider that truly record-breaking storms are terrifying, whirling maelstroms of elemental fury that can flatten a quantifiable percentage of the geography in which it lands. What follows is a list of 10 of the most insane and admittedly nebulous term that could refer to size, power, or simply the sheer magnitude of destruction wrought, but they're interesting nonetheless. But first, a note. I'm going to be using terms like hurricane, cyclone, and typhoon a lot during this video, and that's something I've always personally found annoying when content mentioning these discs of pure destructive force assumes that you, the audience, just knows what the difference is. So let's correct that. And paradoxically, all of those words, hurricane, cyclone, typhoon, refer to the same thing, but they do have specific definitions. So National Geographic clarifies the differences between hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons, which are fundamentally the same thing, but are given the name hurricane, cyclone, or typhoon, depending on where they make landfall. So a hurricane is called a hurricane when they develop over the North Atlantic, Central North Pacific, and Eastern North Pacific. These rotating storms are then known as cyclones when they form over the South Pacific and Indian Ocean, and finally typhoons when they develop in the Northwest Pacific. Let's move on to number 10, the perfect storm. So does anyone remember that painfully 2000s film called The Perfect Storm, where George Clooney has to fistfight a double hurricane to save a bunch of fish that he caught? Well, that is based on a true story, with the words based on doing a phenomenal amount of heavy lifting, because the families of several people involved with the actual perfect storm, alluded to in the film's title, threatened to sue the studio. Annoyingly, quite unsuccessfully. I say annoyingly because they sued the studio for portraying their loved ones as incompetent, and they didn't bother to change the names, and that's apparently just a thing Hollywood can do. If you die in a natural disaster, Hollywood can just take your name and make a movie about you and portray you as an utter idiot. Moving back to the perfect storm, and for the curious out there, yes, there was an actual boat that was actually caught in a big-ass storm as portrayed in the film, but none of them survived. In fact, pretty much the only thing from the movie that has any real basis in reality is that there was really a hurricane that absorbed another hurricane, and that a boat called the Andrea Gale was struck by this double hurricane. Specifically, the perfect storm of 1991, the one that happened in our world, not the movie, began as a pretty powerful but not technically hurricane-force storm off the coast of Canada that somehow merged with another powerful windstorm, Hurricane Grace. Something I had no idea could actually happen, and I'm now terrified to think about the consequences of. Anyway, this new Frankenstein's monster of a storm flattened several square miles of Massachusetts, leaving thousands homeless and just over a dozen dead, which admittedly doesn't seem, for lack of a better worded term, all that bad considering the storm's infamy. Like, it was literally called the perfect storm. But like with any monstrous creation beyond our reckoning, it's how the storm killed people that's the truly scary part. In addition to wiping the Andrea Gale from the face of the earth, sinking it below the waves never to be found again, the storm caused deaths as far away as Puerto Rico, where an unsuspecting person was, and I'm not making this up, simply swept away by a large wave, never to be seen again, as if grabbed by Poseidon himself. Finally, because this is kind of odd, the storm technically doesn't have a name, with the perfect storm, while commonly used in literature and videos like this one, not being the name used by experts who refer to the storm simply as the no-name storm, which I can't decide is more or less horrifying to think about. Like, this thing doesn't have a name, but moving on. Number 9, the TriState tornado outbreak. Speaking of films, you know that thing you see in media featuring tornadoes where a person is lifted by the high winds as if by the very hand of God himself and whipped away into the maelstrom of screaming wind before anyone is able to help? You Probably assume that's an invention of Hollywood, because surely anyone close enough to a tornado for such a thing to happen would either already be dead or not visible due to the tornado raging ahead. Well, tell that to George Boland, one of many victims of the so-called TriState tornado outbreak, the single deadliest and longest ranging outbreak of tornadoes in American history. Also, for anyone wondering, yes, I said tornado outbreak, as in multiple tornadoes touching down at once, with even experts on tornadoes noting they don't really know just how many tornadoes touched down during this freak weather event. What we do know, however, is that in 1925, at least 12 tornadoes touched down in and around Kentucky, Kansas, Missouri, Indiana, Illinois, and Alabama, which, if you've noticed, is 6 states, not 3, as the name Tri-State Tornado Outbreak would suggest. But I guess, would it be the Sexta State outbreak? Just doesn't have the same ring to it. Among the hundreds of fatalities, perhaps the most harrowing to consider is the aforementioned George Boland, a deputy sheriff with the Jackson County Police Department who, according to several eyewitness accounts, was lifted by the winds directly into the tornado's funnel, like the gaping maw of some ravenous beast, and then nothing. His body was never found. Moving swiftly on, number 8, the 1999 Odisha Cyclone. A storm can't be considered a hurricane, or in this case a cyclone, until it has sustained winds of at least 70 miles an hour. And we do know that the Odisha Cyclone far exceeded that. What we do not know, though, is by how much, because the force of the storm was such that the instruments specifically designed to measure the wind speed failed in the face of its fury. Regarded as one of the worst cyclones to hit Odisha, with the effects of the storm being felt in neighbouring Myanmar and Bangladesh, to the point it is officially recognised as, get this, a super cyclone. Now, you'd be forgiven for assuming that the danger posed by a super cyclone would be, well, the wind, which is true, but what can and often does catch people off guard is what the wind carries with it. In this case, rain. Lots and lots of rain. As an idea of just how much water this storm displaced, it's noted that almost a metre of rain fell in just 3 days on the town of Adupa, while the entire Odisha region had to deal with about half of that. According to some witnesses, the rain fell with such ferocity that trees were stripped of leaves, while the floodwaters themselves literally washed away roads, and in some cases, entire buildings. Moving on, number 7, Typhoon Tip. So let's imagine you're in the unfortunate position of being trapped by a typhoon. Rain is pounding on the roof above with sledgehammer-like force, and the winds outside are causing the walls themselves to buckle. How could this situation possibly get any worse? If you said everything was also on fire somehow, you have just described the situation Marine Station in Japan found themselves in 1979 when Typhoon Tip struck. One of the largest typhoons to strike the region, the high winds of Typhoon Tip savaged the Camp Fuji training facility in Yokosuka, prompting many of the Marine stationed there to take refuge inside of several huts at the bottom of a large hill. The latter detail is very important, and I'd like you to keep it in mind. Unbeknownst to the Marines inside, the winds outside had damaged a large rubber bladder containing some 5,000 gallons of fuel, stored partway up the hill. You can probably guess what happened next. In an instant, the Marines experienced what we imagine is as close to hell on earth as one can get, as a literal tidal wave of fire crashed through the wall. According to one survivor of the ordeal, all they could recall was a, and I quote, hand of heat picking them up and hurling them out of a nearby door. When they came to their senses, all they could see was, and I quote once again, fire and darkness, which was punctuated by the screams of both the wind and the men inside who'd not been as lucky. Today, a memorial to those lost stands where this incident occurred. Number 6, the Bowler Cyclone. Everything being on fire sounds like pretty much the worst thing that could happen as a result of a cyclone, hurricane, or typhoon, right? Well, I think I found something that might top it, as unbelievable as that may sound. The threat of nuclear annihilation, which sounds ridiculous and requires a bit of explaining, so allow me to do that. So, the 1970 Bowler Cyclone was bad. Like, real bad, as in almost 500,000 people or more died. We don't actually know, it's hard to know given that the storm literally washed away entire villages. But it's the response to the storm that risked killing millions more. Or should we say, the lack of response. And we've actually made a full video on our sister channel, Geographics, that goes into more detail. But the key thing to note is that it led to months of civil unrest and the formation of Bangladesh as an independent country, something that was wrought with controversy, death, and exacerbated the ongoing Cold War, bringing the entire world to the very precipice of nuclear decimation. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, which is a story for another day. Or right now, if you click the link somewhere below me to find out more from our sister channel, which I also presented. Number 5, the Great Hurricane of 1780. Hurricanes and similar natural disasters are often described as acts of God, mostly for insurance purposes and the like. But have you ever stopped to think about what the more God-fearing people of the past thought about the heavens themselves opening up and what appeared to be the booming voice of the Almighty himself, erupting from the sky to level a city? must have felt like? Well, imagine no more, because that's what happened to the people of Barbados when the so-called Great Hurricane of 1780 struck. According to several surviving reports from people who, oddly enough, took refuge in churches, the winds of the hurricane were such that trees were ripped from the earth, buildings entirely flattened, and cannons used by British forces stationed on the island were lifted clear into the air and thrown into the ocean hundreds of feet away. And speaking of the British, the hurricane may also have tipped the scales of the American Revolutionary War in America's favour, with the British losing some of its most powerful warships and most experienced commanders to the hurricane. One example being the HMS Thunderer, commanded by Commodore Robert Boyle Walsingham, a man who rather prophetically warned Parliament that the Royal Navy, as powerful as it was nowhere near strong enough to do what they hoped to achieve, shortly before he and 680 men under his command were swept away beneath the waves, never to be seen again. Exactly how much of a difference these ships would have made to the British war efforts isn't clear, but at least one source we consulted sagely notes that a key moment in the Revolutionary War was the French blockade of General Cornwallis's army at Yorktown, a battle that the French handily won, thanks to them outnumbering the British almost 2-1, with the French having 26 ships to the Britishers' 19. What would have happened if the Great Hurricane hadn't outright destroyed 15 ships and scuttled 9 more isn't clear, but it's fascinating to think about that the entire path of history may have been changed by this. But that's a story for another day, and we now move on to number 4, the super outbreak. Tornadoes are sometimes referred to as the fingers of God, and it's hard not to see why. Looking at them in motion, you can almost imagine that they're the vast digit of some uncaring deity, lazily tracing along the path of their own creation, unfazed or simply unable to even notice the destruction such a simple action wreaks upon those below. Now imagine if God had 15 fingers, and you're close to picturing what people in the Midwest states saw in 1974, when that many tornadoes touched down simultaneously. Considered the worst tornado outbreak ever recorded, though not necessarily the largest. That's an honour claimed by the UK, which experienced an outbreak of more tornadoes in 1981, though they certainly did less damage, hence this outbreak we're talking about being considered the worst. Part of what made this super outbreak so dangerous and deadly is that services simply weren't equipped to deal with having its resources' arse kicked by this many tornadoes at once, something Congress addressed by funneling millions into tornado warning infrastructure and research, something which we hope shows the scale and magnitude of this particular outbreak. Number 3, the Labor Day hurricane. When it comes to discussions about hurricanes and the like, a common way to get across the power and ferocity of the wind is to show examples of the destructive power the winds possess. And in that vein, the Labor Day hurricane of 1935 may have been one of the most harrowing. A several hundred-ton train swept clear off its tracks. It certainly makes for a striking image, but the story is more haunting still. This mighty locomotive spread across the earth like an untied bootlace was supposed to be rescuing World War I veterans working nearby. Amazingly, nobody aboard the train died, but it being unable to accomplish its goal of rescuing people no doubt led to the deaths of many veterans of the First World War, something which understandably caused an outrage, with perhaps nobody's fury being greater than that of famed author Ernest Hemingway, who wrote a scathing essay fittingly titled "Who Murdered the Vets?" shortly thereafter. A later inquiry levelled the blame squarely at nature itself, with the government noting that none of the infrastructure in place at the time could have predicted such a disaster, which is fair. You just don't expect a train to get blown off its tracks by the wind. Number 2, the Great Galveston Hurricane. Described as the deadliest storm to strike the continental United States, the story of the Galveston Hurricane is more frustrating than anything else, as the vast loss of life was largely a result of bureaucratic incompetence and dick measuring. There's no other way to put it. Making landfall in 1900, just 10 years after the forerunner to the National Weather Service, the Weather Bureau, was created, and in a time when everything weather-related had to go through a web of red tape before being made public, almost everything about the Galveston Hurricane is just infuriating to talk about, and was infuriating to research as well. As just one example, consider the story of Isaac Klein, who was the head of the Weather Bureau at the time, and he was sure that the forecast he'd gotten from suits in the Capitol was wrong. Like, disastrously wrong, and he wanted to warn the people of Galveston, Texas, that they could be in danger. Despite being the literal head of the agency tasked with warning people about this sort of thing, Klein was told not to issue a warning that contradicted Washington's reports. Klein did so anyway, with he himself claiming that he pole-revered his way across the parts of the city most at risk, telling people that a hurricane was coming. This, however, is disputed. To be clear, Klein did issue a warning to the people of the city, ignoring the direct order of his superiors. It's just not clear if he did so from horseback whilst the coming storm whipped and howled around him. A sad bookend to this tale is that Klein's own wife was one of the people lost to the storm, one of many others who could have sought shelter and survived if not for all of that bureaucratic nonsense. And finally, we end with the Dalapur-Saturia tornado. Whenever tornadoes are mentioned, most people think of the United States. I mean, there's literally a part of the United States colloquially referred to as a tornado alley. However, the aforementioned country of Bangladesh is notably where the deadliest tornadoes occur. In fact, depending on how you count it, it can be argued that the majority of the deadliest tornadoes in recorded history happen within the country's borders, and the worst of all was the Dalapur-Saturia tornado of 1989. While nowhere near the strongest tornado ever recorded, with there being some disagreement about whether the tornado will be considered an F3 or an F4 on the Fujita scale, the highest for the curious is a 5, but the destruction it caused is inarguable. Part of the reason why is simply nobody in the area was prepared for such a disaster. The modest rural homes of residents stood no chance against the several 100-mile-per-hour winds, nor did trees or indeed anything really, with the tornadoes causing almost complete and utter destruction of the entire area in which it touched down. Exacerbating things even further were the ongoing effects of a severe drought in the area, which had weakened trees and left vast swathes of dust about. And this resulted in the trees being torn apart by the wind and turned into lethal projectiles, and the dust becoming a choking, skin-eviscerating cloud of grit. Most of the approximately 1,300 deaths occurred almost immediately after the tornado touched down. And finally, because what better way to end such a distressing and harrowing video than with an ironic, cruel twist of fate right out of a movie. Just days before the tornado and the multiple storms it brought with it killed 1,300 people, the then President Mohammed Ershad had encouraged the people of Bangladesh to pray for rain.